Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Brad Harbison. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar, Rats and Baits, Why the Mystery, which is presented by SenesTech, manufacturer of ContraPest, which is a fertility control solution for rats. I think you're going to enjoy and find today's webinar very thought-provoking. During the next hour, we're going to learn why rat behavior is such a mystery when it comes to the introduction of new baits into their environment. We're happy to have as our presenter Brandy Paisina. Brandy leads the scientific operations and technical services teams at SenesTech, and Brandy has been with SenesTech since 2009, beginning in Dr. Loretta Mayer's lab as a grad assistant. And Brandy's time at SenesTech also includes serving as field operations manager, where she applied the SenesTech technology in a wide variety of field environments. And in her current position, Brandy leads the transition between laboratory research, field trials, and the delivery of effective pest management solutions to customers. One quick note to pass along before we get started here is you can ask questions to Brandy anytime throughout the webinar by instant messaging them to us. And you can do so by typing them into the question box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brandy.
Thank you, Brad, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for taking time today to listen and learn about rat behavior and why they are so finicky when it comes to consuming baits today. I really love rat behavior. I find rats really fascinating. The fact that we just taught them to drive cars just blows my mind. So I'm glad all of you are here, and I hope you find this very interesting. So today we're going to first start off with discussing how the history and movements of rats. It's important to talk about how rats actually became very commensal with us and became such a big pest. Then we will go into rat behavior, really focusing on how their senses influence their behavior. With that, then we'll begin discussing some feeding attributes, why they do the things that they do when they consume food. And then we will go more heavily into neophobia, bait shyness, and bait aversion. This is a big topic in terms of why there are so many challenges sometimes when it comes to controlling rats. So, as I said, I want to begin to demonstrate how rats migrated and became so closely associated with humans. This is a map that was taken from a study in 2016 and 2002, and this shows that the rats followed about 5 routes out of China and Mongolia. The first expansion traveled southward towards Southeast Asia, and you have 2 different colors here. You have a white arrow and a gray arrow. The white arrows are the path of what we believe is the Norway rat, and the gray arrow is the path for the black rat. But what researchers found is black rats were thought to migrate first from the southeastern Asia area. They did so by following farming and trading routes that were much more commonly practiced in southern Asia than northern Asia. And from there, they migrated to Europe. The brown rats were then able to colonize eastern North America, South America, Africa, and New Zealand via ships that were originating from the European colonies. Some of these rats migrated from the Alaskan islands toward the Pacific coast of North America, while there was another group that ventured west, making it through Western Asia, Middle East, and into Europe. And then you have them split again into some Western European and Northern Europeans types subspecies. It's believed that the black rats reached the New World in the 16th century, while the brown rats arrived around the 1700s. Norway rats, since they're a little bit more competitive, they displaced a lot of the black rats from their former territories. And I'm sure a lot of us know this, but Norway rats spread a lot of diseases, mostly from their parasites such as fleas. And they're most particularly known for the spread of black plague. And while roof rats are not as common in most of Europe anymore and mostly in the subtropical areas, they're a major threat to island conservation. It's these movements into more populated areas that brought rats and diseases in closer proximity with humans, and thus we needed to begin controlling them. Rat control began simply with the use of dogs, cats, or traps, some poisons. Mostly this was from homeowners or the help that they hired. But eventually exterminators arose, and this began to evolve into the modern pest control programs of today. Rat control is always a challenging job, and there are many factors that affect the efficacy of a program and why rats may or may not consume the products that we put out. Today, I'm going to focus more on how behavior plays a factor in controlling these rats, but as you can see, this list is bigger than behavior and definitely not all the topics that we could discuss today. As Bobby Corrigan has pointed out, understanding rodent physiology can help us understand their behavior and how they interact with the environment. It's a combination of behavior and physiology that makes rats such a successful species. In order to control rats, we really have to think like a rat and understand their behavior. If we don't, we'll not only have a difficult time controlling them, we may affect their behaviors and actually create a bigger problem. So let's begin discussing how rat senses affect their behavior. Rats have developed the ability to memorize movements to get from point A to point B, mostly along their well-traveled pathways. This is really important because it helps them avoid traps and devices when they're under pressure. So if they're being chased or they think that they are about to be preyed upon, they will just run through their environment without really having to think about it. We all should know that rats are most active from dusk to dawn, but what's great is they have developed their vision to be most effective during this nighttime. Rats have a great distance vision and can detect motion pretty well. However, they cannot see very far away. They only have a depth perception of about 1 meter or about 3 feet. Their eyes can move independently of each other on both the horizontal and vertical plane while traveling. This enables them to always be able to see what's above them or what's on the sides of them. Remember, these guys are prey species, so they always want to know what's going on around them. Their vision does have a great impact on their behavior. Since their vision isn't perfect, they rely more on their sense of smell and touch. This allows them to this causes them to gravitate more towards the shadowed areas, meaning they see better in dark areas, which allows them to be able to watch for danger at all times. So maybe when we put out stations, we need to consider that there need to be in shadowed areas. They feel a little bit safer in these areas. Now, rat whiskers, or vibrissae, they are a major factor in their behavior. Whiskers are comparable to fingers. They're very important in providing information from the environment. Rats' brains make a map of what they touch with their whiskers the same way our hands make maps of what we touch with our hands. So whiskers can sense texture, position, and the shape of objects. And what's fascinating is they can move back and forth independently of each other and independently of their cheek muscles. And this is actually called whisking. When they begin to whisk, they obtain a lot of feedback from the environment, and they always try to stay in contact with surfaces. Corners provide some of the best responses for whiskers. And it's the type of movement that limits the directions from which predators can approach. This is why harborage, or knowing how quickly to get to harborage, is so important. The rat sense of smell is highly developed, and it also has a huge effect on bait consumption and aversion. Rats use their sense of smell to find food, identify colony members, identify pathways, or even territories. Urine and pheromones are used to communicate with each other, and depending on what messages are relayed will depend on how rats respond to that object. Pheromones can be alert pheromones, which indicates to the colony that something is not right, and maybe they should avoid that situation or be a little bit more cautious towards it. There is a lot of research going into the use of sex pheromones and how it can aid in controlling rats. I don't know the latest and most greatest on this, so I'm not going to touch on that very much, but know that it is being heavily researched. Smell is also such an important factor that when we are controlling them, we have to be careful of our sense. Rats will eat almost everything, but if other rats have put down pheromones indicating that something is bad with the food, they're going to avoid that product. Rats also will learn to become adverse to these pheromones. They will smell, just like I already discussed, rats will smell humans on objects, and unless other pheromones are laid on top of that smell, they might avoid the objects that we touch. This is why it's really, really important to wash our hands, not wear strong cologne, make sure that we do whatever we can to not trigger any sort of effect on the rat's sense of smell. And while we may wear gloves while controlling rats, it's important to do so with clean hands, because even when you put your hands into the gloves, you're still touching the outsides of them to put them on. So it's really important to think about that. And like smell, taste is very important to rats. Just like us, they respond to sweet, bitter, salty, sour, and even umami, which is pretty interesting because umami is considered the savory sense. So it's similar to the broth, the flavor in broth or cooked meats. Also, similar to us, their tastes change as they get older. There are really no universally accepted baits. I'm sure if you've talked to your colleagues in different regions of the country or even the world, you're going to hear different ways that they bait. When I was working in Southeast Asia, I was told that people would never trap with anything unless it was dried fish. But if you talk to people in Hawaii, they actually use coconut or even toasted coconut to trap rats. So there's no universally accepted bait, but people based on regions believe rats have different tastes, which is probably true. But regardless, there are certain flavors that work better than others. Baits that are high in sugars, that are sweet, made with fats or salts, make the best baits, while bitter baits are often rejected. Rats can also detect substances in very low concentrations. In fact, it's 250 parts per billion. And to put this into perspective, 1 part per billion is equivalent to 1 pinch of salt in 10 tons of potato chips, or it's 3 seconds out of a century. So it's a very, very small concentration in a much bigger substance. So we have to be careful on what flavors we place into our baits. So let's look a little bit more into their feeding behaviors in general. Now that we know how they like to eat, how they like to receive messages from the environment, it's really important to think about how they actually like to feed. Some of us might not know, but adult rats can consume 15 to 30 grams of food per day and somewhere between 30 to 60 mils of water a day. This is approximately 10% of their body weight per water per day. And they never eat all in one sitting. They will eat several small meals throughout the night or whenever they're foraging. Rats will consume food that is highly nutritional, and when food is abundant, they can become kind of picky. They're omnivorous, so they'll eat whatever's in the environment. They're not necessarily solely vegetable-based or meat-based. They'll eat whatever's available to them. Their feeding preference is established by their mother, as pups can smell and taste what their mother is eating. And once pups can start leaving the nest, they will follow their mothers to feeding sites and learn what to eat. Since rats are prey species, they need to feel safe when they eat. They generally prefer to eat near cover or will bring food back to their nests. This hoarding behavior makes choosing the appropriate bait important in sensitive areas. Pellets, tackets, or large pieces of block are most likely to be catched. And foods that are grain-based or cereal-based are often the most preferred. So we need to just think about it when we're putting out baits. Now, when it comes to the differences between Norway and roof rats, there are some differences in their feeding behaviors, but they're pretty similar. Norways are almost always close to us. Roof rats are close to us, but since Norways are a little bit more prominent of a species, Norways will generally eat whatever is available. Rats, the black rats, as I said, they do live close to humans, but there are many that still live in islands independently of humans, and those animals will rely on seeds, nuts, berries, insects, slugs. Black rats do like to forage in actually big groups and will eat small amounts of food from more places. While Norways will forage several times a day, they might not travel as far or consume from as many sources. Subordinates may be forced to feed on leftovers or less nutritional foods. This is why seeing an animal out in the daytime is sometimes a sign that we have a bigger infestation, and that's some serious concern. And regardless of the species, successful bait uptake is influenced by their behavior and how they interact with their environment. But we also have to consider that they have this innate ability to just be cautious. We have to always consider that when it comes to controlling them. Some behavioral traits are thought to be inherited, as rats have evolved with humans and our abilities to control them, while other behaviors are conditioned through adverse food learning in their environment. So before rats transitioned to living with us a lot more, when they were eating seeds and berries, they would still sample it to see would that make them ill in any way. So it just transitioned while they evolved with us. Behavioral resistance describes the range of behavioral traits that can reduce an animal's tendency to consume lethal doses of toxic baits. These behaviors are neophobia, which is the fear of new, bait shyness, which is a cautious feeding strategy, and finally, bait aversion, which is the assessment of bait properties from adverse stimuli. So let's go a little bit more in depth into these, because this is really what we have to also think about when it comes to controlling rats. So neophobia, or again, the fear of new, has been studied for decades and is a common behavior in all rats. This may have been the result of evolution with humans and heavy baiting campaigns. It has been seen in the research that populations isolated from humans have less neophobia than populations that are very close to humans. And variations in neophobia are also seen between species. For example, rats tend to be more neophobic than mice. Mice actually tend to be drawn towards new feeding sites, which is very different than Norway rats. Neophobia can vary between populations of the same species. So Norway rats in a city dump may be less neophobic than rats in a multifamily housing complex. And rats also within the same population can show varying levels of neophobia. Sometimes you see juveniles are less cautious than that alpha female or that alpha male that we're trying to control. So neophobia does occur, but it comes in varying degrees and it can vary even within that same population. And it makes our baiting and trapping campaigns very difficult. And there are some things that occur that can increase the chances of neophobia, and there's some things that can cause neophobia to less likely occur. So let's talk first about the things that will cause neophobia or invoke neophobia. If we place baits that have been previously eaten in or on top of a new object, this will potentially cause neophobia. If we replace an object in the environment with a new one, or move that object, that familiar object, to a brand new location, that will cause us to lose some time in the baiting. And even small changes in bait stations might cause changes in their neophobia. In comparison, if we place new foods in a familiar container or have less stable environments, neophobia is a little bit less. So it really depends on how stable the environment is when it comes to controlling rats. If we don't want to cause neophobia, we need to be cautious of our actions. We shouldn't place bait stations close to the runway, or at least not directly on them at first. When we do this, we prevent the rat's natural exploratory behavior. Neophobia will decrease with repeated and continuous exposure of that new object. This is why we should leave bait stations in place, especially during the pre-baiting period. If we're doing a pre-baiting period, we should do so with familiar foods or highly palatable flavors. This will initiate feeding more quickly than if we just put out something that the rats have never seen or consumed before. Maybe cover the stations or the traps with familiar materials that are on the site. And this includes seasoning the traps or the bait stations before introducing those control methods. And as discussed previously, make sure your hands are clean and you're scent-free. Rats have that highly developed sense of smell, and if they smell you on those bait stations or traps, we could lose some time before the rats overcome their neophobia and begin to actually enter that station. Now, bait shyness is the cautious feeding behavior that is often confused with aversion. Remember, this is an innate behavior that rats have always had, even when they are not living with humans. After rats overcome neophobia of a new food or object, it will begin to sample that food. Rats will sample the foods and learn to associate any physiological actions with those different foods. For example, if rats sample it and it makes them not feel so well, they'll stop consuming that food. If it doesn't make them ill, they'll sample it again. And rats will also sample foods and learn to associate this with different locations too, as much as they do with familiar foods and familiar locations. Age and sex don't play a factor in this behavior. It occurs in all age brackets and all sexes. And this allows rats to rapidly change from a familiar but distasteful food to a new but palatable food. And even if the rats feel satisfied by the food that they're consuming, they'll continue to sample. Again, they eat in small doses throughout the night. They're not going to just eat that whole block in one sitting. They're going to come back to it multiple times, maybe even over multiple nights. Now, bait aversion occurs when a rat learns to respond to a negative event or action. Rats are selective and they have the ability to learn to reject toxic substances by being shy about trying new foods and constantly sampling. They also have the ability to learn to avoid snap traps. If they even get pinched a little bit or it scares them, they will not run over that trap again. The rat's behavior is a sample of why some toxic baits try to accomplish death in one take. Rats may not come back to consume that product if they feel ill. So if we can get them to consume a small amount that is lethal, that's the best. But no matter how much we try to improve palatability, it doesn't prevent aversion. Anything toxic can become repellent to rats. If a palatable, non-toxic compound is added to a toxic bait, rats will still develop aversion. Then the rats will avoid that non-toxic compound, even if it's provided in new mixtures. So remember, taste buds have a role in aversion, and they have a huge factor in this. Researchers have found that a rat's sense of smell, if it's prohibited, aversion will still occur. And while there is research on social aversion, it does vary dependent on which article you read and which decade it was written in. Some research shows that sick rats may omit a smell or a pheromone that influences the behavior of others, or while other research shows that rats may prefer to eat foods eaten by their sick friends. So it's definitely varying in the research, but rats will become averse and may learn from each other. So just like neophobia and just like bait shyness, we need to make sure our actions aren't causing any more problems when it comes to controlling rats. We need to make sure that we're not causing any rats to become bait averse. So pre-baiting is really one of the better choices that we have. It's best to familiarize rats to feed on a product that they've probably been eating for several days, and then switch it out for poisons. This will be best accomplished if we have similar flavors of the pre-bait and the toxicant bait. Because remember, rats, even if it's a familiar food, that's better for them than if it's in a new container with unfamiliar choices. So as we discussed at the beginning of this webinar today, there are many factors that cause us problems when controlling rats. Some of them, frankly, may be us. We may not have removed the competing resources. We may have provided rats a bait that doesn't compete with those resources. We may have made a small change in the bait station design, and we might have been focused more on the safety of that bait station than making sure rats feel comfortable upon entering it. Rat behavior in general may be overriding our ability to be successful. That's probably the majority of our cases, I would like to hope. We need to be patient and allow rats to overcome neophobia and any shyness. If we can take that time, that will increase our overall success. We might be training rats to be averse, which makes our ability to control them even harder. We possibly have put bait stations in the bad locations. We might not have made rats feel comfortable in the locations we've placed them. Or simply, we didn't satisfy all the rats' tastes and needs. We might not have provided them a cereal grain-based bait, or we might not have met their need for water per day. But there might be, products on the market that satisfy their need for water and fatty tastes, and we'd be happy to tell you more about that. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. I love talking about rat behavior. They're such fascinating little creatures, but I hope that you've learned something new that will improve our ability to control them. So Brad, I'll happily take any questions from the audience.
Thanks, Brandy. We did get some questions that came in, and for folks that still would like to ask a question, and again, you can do so by typing them into the question box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And like I mentioned, we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Brandy, the first question we had was, what ingredients are in ContraPest that makes it palatable in comparison to rodenticides?
So ContraPest is made of mostly water. There are some sweeteners and some oils in it. So it helps rats with a lot of their tasty needs.
Next question we had was, what testing has been done to show that rats will consume contrapests when other liquids that may be in the rat foraging areas?
That's a great question, actually. So prior to registration, EPA registration, we did a lot of field trials. And one of our field trials was on a protein production facility. So there is a lot of water available to the animals. And we had consumption with all of that water available to the animals. We were also baiting in the spring, summertime, and we had a lot of rainstorms. So there were a lot of puddles exterior to the buildings. And we had a lot of consumption in that project. But when it comes to actually what are the customers seeing, we are hearing from customers that they're seeing consumption in the presence of anything that's in their environment, when it comes to water, puddles, gardens, those types of things.
Question we had was, what process/approach do you recommend for adding contrapest as part of my IPM program? And there's a follow-up to that too, I'll ask as well.
Okay.
It says, so more specifically, what do you recommend I do next if the rats do not seem to be consuming the contrapest?
Okay, so we'll start with the first question first. I always recommend that we find the best locations to place contrapest. Just like any lethal toxicant, if the rats aren't consuming contrapest, it's not going to be effective. So we need to make sure that we're putting contrapest in areas that rats will actually forage. We don't necessarily need to put it every 25, 50, 100 feet. Put it where it's best going to be consumed. And if you have an area that's hot and you need to put 2 stations so that there's enough product to last until your next visit, we can do that as well. I also recommend keeping contrapest away from lethals. I often get asked, well, instead of putting 2 inserts, a tank and a tray inside the bait station, can I put in 1 contrapest tank and tray and put the lethal on the other side to save me time on servicing stations? And the answer to that is, please don't. We don't want to cause any aversion to contrapest. We want to make sure that they're consuming the product, thus being effective. So just keep those 2 away from each other the best that we can. We always recommend 10 feet or more, but again, it's going to depend on where you're baiting. So, and then the follow-up was, what happens if rats don't consume? Is that right, Brad?
It says, what do you recommend if the rats do not seem to be consuming the contrapest?
Okay. So I always recommend that if rats aren't consuming contrapest, we might have neophobic rats on site. We also may be dealing with aversion. So I always recommend an incentive treat, especially if you're in one of those areas where rats are just always going after that particular, dog food or bird food or your neighbor's trash can. I always recommend adding some sort of an incentive treat. And if we have to, if we notice that there's no consumption even after adding an incentive treat, maybe we need to re-explore where that bait station is deployed. And if it continues after that, go ahead and give the team a call at the technical services line here at SenesTech, and we'd be happy to try to walk you through whatever else is going on.
Question we had was, what is the best design for bait stations in order to improve efficacy?
So some of the research on bait stations is rats really like to not be as hunched over as much when they're eating a cereal or grain base. So the ones that have the taller lids, so they can kind of sit up on their haunches, those might have better influence on their behavior. And sometimes the bait stations, as long as they can see all the way through it and know that there's nothing in between that can hurt them, those are usually the best ones in terms of design. There's probably a lot of other designs that are coming out that are going to be just as efficacious.
Question we had was, what are some types of pheromone products for use in bait stations to improve efficacy?
Like I said, I didn't touch too much on this because I'm not as up to speed on the research, but I know there are sex pheromones being researched right now to see if we can attract animals to our stations and or traps. And sometimes I've even heard this, like using the smell of pups. That could be something too, but again, that one I'm not as familiar on as the sex pheromones.
Question we had was, do rats learn from each other or only from their mother, and why?
So rats do learn from their mother, as we discussed in the talk today. They will learn what to eat, where to eat, how to get to that food source. And the research does say that rats will learn from each other, with a couple of caveats that says maybe they don't.
Question we had was, in general, what are the best locations to place bait stations?
The best places to place bait stations, we need rats to consume whatever we're providing them, whether it's contrapest or a rodenticide. So wherever they are foraging, feel safe, feel that they are okay if they stop in that bait station and consume the product, those are generally the best. Sometimes not out in the open, along the walls, not necessarily always right next to the doorway, because again, they might not feel safe. So under objects, under rocks, in the shadowy areas sometimes might be the best.
Question we have, I'll answer the next question. A couple of folks had asked about getting a copy of the presentation. Yes, we are recording this webinar, and once we get it edited and cleaned up a little bit, we'll post it up on our website, and you'll also get a copy of it in your email as well. Or you can also just contact either us, PCT, or the folks at SenesTech, and I'm sure they'll be happy to provide you with a copy as well. Let's see. The next question we had here was, do black and brown rats typically cohabitate, or do they generally stick to their own colonies, even though they have similar behaviors?
From what I'm understanding, what I've heard from a lot of people and seen is it's not very common for black and brown rats to cohabitate. It might occur in very rare circumstances. They do compete for similar resources, but they have their different niches that they live in. But generally, the Norways will always try to displace those black rats.
A question we had here says, you mentioned the use of bait stations throughout your presentation. Is this the only way to bait to ensure bait aversion can be mitigated?
That's a great question. So bait aversion is definitely a learned behavior. Bait stations themselves might not be influencing the aversion. It's mostly the products that the rats have been adverse to. Of course, that if we are placing snap traps in bait stations, rats might begin to become averse to certain objects. But again, if we pre-bait, we might be able to reduce some of our aversion and giving them products that are of the same flavor that they're used to.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Brandy. If there's any questions we didn't get to, again, I just encourage you to follow up with the folks at SenesTech, and they'll be happy to answer. Again, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. And before we sign off here, we'll turn things back over to Brandy for any final words and reminders she wants to pass along. Brandy?
Oh, thank you, Brad. Everybody, thank you so much for all of your questions and all of your time today. Definitely give us a call if you have any follow-up questions, and I hope that you'll think of like a rat next time you're out in the field.